late summer of 1888, the narrow alleys and fog-filled streets of London's East End carried an air of unease. Whitechapel, already infamous for its poverty, overcrowding, and crime, became the center of one of history's darkest mysteries. It was here that an unknown killer, remembered forever as Jack the Ripper, began his reign of terror. His brutal crimes would shock Victorian society, ignite global headlines, and leave behind a haunting mystery that has never been solved. To understand the horror of the Whitechapel murders, one must first understand the world in which they took place. London, the largest city in the world at the time, was a place of stark contrasts. In the West End, wealth and opulence thrived, grand theaters, gas-lit boulevards, and gentlemen's clubs defined the lives of the privileged. But in the East End, the picture was far different. Whitechapel was a district of desperation. Thousands of immigrants, mostly Irish and Jewish, packed into lodging houses where up to 80 people might share a single room. Narrow lanes were filled with drunken brawls, illegal taverns, and constant poverty. Work was scarce, and for many women, survival depended on prostitution. The police estimated that more than 200 women in Whitechapel worked the streets at night. It was these vulnerable women who would become the Ripper's victims. The first murder to attract public attention came on August 31st, 1888, when the body of Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly, was found in Bucks Row. She was a 43-year-old sex worker who had been forced onto the streets after a life of hardship and alcohol dependency. At around 3:40 a.m., her body was discovered by a cart driver. Nichols had been brutally attacked, her throat slit twice from left to right, and her abdomen viciously mutilated. The savagery was shocking, but at first, the police were unsure if this was just another act of street violence. Only a week later, on September 8, 1888, another woman, Annie Chapman, was found dead in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. Like Nichols, her throat had been cut, but this time the mutilations were far worse. Chapman's abdomen had been opened and her organs partly removed. The ferocity of the killing sent shudders through the community. Panic began to spread. Newspapers screamed with headlines of a fiend in human form. By now, the police realized they were facing something unprecedented. This was no ordinary murderer. This was someone who killed with precision and who appeared to take pleasure in dissection. Rumors began to circulate that the killer might be a butcher, a surgeon, or someone with medical knowledge. The people of Whitechapel lived in fear. Women refused to walk the streets alone, and men formed vigilante patrols. The East End was already mistrusted by the rest of London, seen as a festering slum of criminals and outsiders. Now, with the murders gaining national attention, the district was painted as the very heart of evil. On September 30, 1888, fear turned to full-blown hysteria. That night, 2 murders took place within the span of an hour. Elizabeth Stride was found in Dutfield's yard, her throat cut, but her body otherwise untouched. Some believe the killer was interrupted before he could mutilate her. Less than an hour later, Catherine Eddowes was found in Mitre Square, brutally disemboweled with her kidney and part of her womb removed. The double event as it was called, confirmed to many that London had a serial killer on its hands, a term that didn't even exist at the time. The final widely accepted Ripper murder came on November 9, 1888, when Mary Jane Kelly was discovered in her tiny room at Miller's Court. Kelly was only 25 years old, younger than the others, and her death was the most horrifying of them all. She had been not just killed, but utterly butchered. Her body was mutilated almost beyond recognition, with her organs scattered across the room. The crime scene was so horrific that even hardened police officers could barely endure the sight. In total, these 5 women, Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, are remembered as the Canonical Five. The victims most historians agree were killed by Jack the Ripper. Yet at the time, more than a dozen other murders of women in Whitechapel were investigated as possibly connected. The true number of his victims remains unknown. The impact of these crimes cannot be overstated. For the first time, the press played a central role in amplifying the fear. London's newspapers, eager to sell copies, published lurid details of the killings and speculated wildly about the killer's identity. The Ripper became a household name almost overnight. The murders also revealed the limits of Victorian policing. There were no fingerprint databases, no DNA testing, and no modern forensic techniques. Detectives relied on eyewitness accounts, which were often contradictory, and on crude post-mortems. The killer seemed to vanish into the night, leaving almost nothing behind. The frustration of the police only fueled the public's anger. Many accused Scotland Yard of incompetence, while others whispered about conspiracy and cover-ups. As the winter of 1888 settled over London, the killings abruptly stopped. No one knows why. Perhaps the killer was arrested for another crime. Perhaps he died or left the city. Or perhaps he simply decided his work was finished. Whatever the truth, the shadow of Jack the Ripper lingered. His crimes became part of London's identity, a grim reminder of the vulnerability of the poor, the failures of the authorities, and the darkness lurking in human nature. But the story of Jack the Ripper is not just about the killings. It is also about the frenzy they created, the letters sent to newspapers, the suspects named and discarded, and the way Victorian society both feared and sensationalized the figure of the unknown killer. To this day, more than 130 years later, the identity of Jack the Ripper remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in history. And so, as the fog continued to curl around the gas lamps of Whitechapel, the legend of Jack the Ripper was born. The city would never forget. As the mutilated bodies of Whitechapel's women continued to appear in the autumn of 1888, the killings were no longer just a local tragedy. They had become a spectacle. London, and soon the entire world, was gripped by a sense of dread. Yet it was not only the violence itself that terrified Victorian society. It was the way the murders were transformed into a media storm, unlike anything before. For the first time, the press and the public found themselves obsessed with the shadow of a faceless killer. In the 1880s, newspapers were becoming more accessible than ever. The penny press allowed working class readers to purchase daily papers at a price they could afford. Publishers understood that scandal and crime sold copies. The Whitechapel murders were, tragically, the perfect story: lurid violence, vulnerable victims, a mysterious villain, and a police force scrambling to keep up. Reporters crowded into the East End, sketching crime scenes, interviewing locals, and sensationalizing every possible detail. The press soon gave the killer a name. Though early headlines referred to the murderer as the Whitechapel Fiend or the Leather Apron, it's a nickname that unfairly targeted Jewish immigrants. It was a letter received by a news agency that forever changed history. On September 27, 1888, the Central News Agency received a chilling letter addressed, "Dear Boss," written in red ink. It mocked the police and the public, describing the killer's joy in mutilating women. It promised further horrors and ended with a signature that would echo through history. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. The letter was almost certainly a hoax, likely written by a journalist eager to keep the story alive. But once it was published, the name stuck. Jack the Ripper captured the imagination of readers, turning the anonymous killer into a legend. Suddenly, the murders had a face, an invisible, taunting phantom who seemed to be playing a game with the authorities. Just days later, the so-called Saucy Jackie postcard arrived, again signed by Jack the Ripper. It referred to the double event of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, boasting of the killings. While the authenticity of the postcard remains doubtful, its timing suggested that whoever wrote it had knowledge of the crimes before the press published details. This fueled even greater fear that the killer was among the very crowd of journalists, onlookers, and police. The most infamous communication came in mid-October. George Lusk, head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, received a small package. Inside was a half-preserved human kidney and a letter written in a crude, taunting style. The letter, now remembered as the "From Hell" letter, claimed that the kidney had been taken from one of the victims and fried and eaten. The grotesque nature of this package horrified the public, who debated endlessly whether it was genuine. Many historians now believe the kidney was indeed human, though whether it truly came from Catherine Eddowes, who had been found missing a kidney, remains uncertain. Each letter, whether real or fake, added to the myth. Jack the Ripper was no longer merely a criminal. He was an unseen narrator of his own terror. The idea that the killer might be communicating with the press, mocking the police, and sharing gruesome trophies turned the murders into something larger than life. The effect on society was immediate and dramatic. Fear gripped every corner of London. In Whitechapel, prostitutes refused to go out alone, and men carried weapons for protection. Vigilance committees patrolled the streets with whistles and clubs, determined to catch the murderer themselves. Scotland Yard received thousands of tips, most of them useless. Every suspicious man, be he a foreigner, a butcher, or even a doctor, was accused in whispers of being the Ripper. The hysteria extended beyond London. Papers in the United States, France, and across Europe reported every new killing, every letter, every rumor. For the first time in history, a serial killer became an international news story. Jack the Ripper was a global figure of terror long before the age of television or the internet. The letters also revealed something darker about human curiosity. Readers were not only horrified, they were fascinated. Circulation soared as the papers printed every gory detail. Illustrations of the murders filled front pages. Satirical cartoons mocked the police. Some people even collected the letters as souvenirs. In a morbid way, the Ripper had become a twisted form of entertainment. The police, meanwhile, were drowning under the pressure. Detectives like Inspector Frederick Aberline struggled to separate genuine leads from hoaxes. Every letter required investigation. Every tip had to be followed. And the flood of false information overwhelmed Scotland Yard. The killer's supposed taunts only deepened public anger at the authorities, who seemed powerless to stop him. There was also a toxic undercurrent of prejudice. Because many immigrants lived in Whitechapel, suspicions often fell on Jewish men and other outsiders. Anti-Semitic riots occasionally erupted after the murders. One piece of graffiti found near a crime scene read, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Fearing a riot, Police Commissioner Sir Charles Warren ordered the graffiti erased before it could be photographed. A decision still debated today. The scapegoating of immigrants reflected the deep social divisions in Victorian London, divisions that the murders only intensified. By the end of 1888, as winter closed in and the killings seemed to stop, the letters slowed too. But the legend of Jack the Ripper was already secured. The name, born out of a likely journalistic hoax, had given the faceless killer an identity more enduring than his crimes alone ever could. The letters made him seem clever, calculating, even theatrical, a villain who enjoyed his role on the stage of London's dark streets. Even today, historians argue about whether any of the Ripper letters were authentic. Most experts believe they were written by hoaxers, journalists, or pranksters. Yet authenticity hardly matters. What matters is the impact they had at the time. Without those letters, Jack the Ripper might have been remembered as merely one of many unsolved killers of the 19th century. With them, he became a figure of legend, immortalized as a name, a shadow, and a warning. The Ripper case proved the power of media in shaping crime stories. It revealed how fear and fascination can be amplified through headlines and sensationalism. And it showed how a killer, whether by design or by coincidence, can become more than a man. He can become a myth. As the fog of Whitechapel thickened, so too did the mystery. The newspapers cried out for justice. The police searched endlessly, and the people demanded answers. But Jack the Ripper remained a ghost, hidden in the alleys and corners of London. The legend was only growing, and soon, speculation about his true identity would take center stage. While London reeled in horror, and the newspapers fanned the flames of panic, the Metropolitan Police found themselves under crushing pressure. Every night, patrolmen walked the damp streets of Whitechapel with lanterns and whistles, scanning the shadows for a hint of the killer. Detectives worked long hours, chasing rumors, interrogating suspects, and following leads that dissolved into nothing. Yet despite their efforts, Jack the Ripper seemed always to be one step ahead. At the time, Scotland Yard's Criminal Investigation Department was still relatively young. The detectives lacked the scientific tools that would later revolutionize crime solving. Fingerprints were not yet used, blood typing was unknown, and DNA analysis was still nearly a century away. Autopsies could reveal cause of death, but not much more. Photographs of crime scenes were rare, and evidence was often contaminated by crowds of curious onlookers before police even arrived. The Ripper exploited these weaknesses perfectly. One of the leading investigators was Inspector Frederick Aberline, a seasoned detective with years of experience in Whitechapel. Aberline knew the neighborhood well and understood the desperation of its people. He believed the killer might be a local man who blended into the slums unnoticed. Yet despite his insight, the trail remained elusive. The police compiled a long list of suspects, though none could be definitively linked to the crimes. One early suspect was John Pizer, a local bootmaker nicknamed Leather Apron because of his work attire. His name spread quickly in the newspapers, and many feared him, believing he preyed on prostitutes. But when the murders occurred, Pizer had solid alibis. He was released, though suspicion lingered among the public. Another prominent suspect was Montague John Droot, a barrister and schoolteacher. Droot was discovered dead in the River Thames in December 1888, an apparent suicide. His death occurred just weeks after the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, the last of the Canonical Five victims. Some police officials privately suspected Droot, believing his mental state may have driven him to kill. However, no solid evidence ever linked him to the crimes. Then there was Aaron Kosminski, a Polish Jewish immigrant who lived in Whitechapel. Kosminski was known to be mentally unstable, and records indicate he was later committed to an asylum. Chief Constable Melville MacNaughton named him as a strong suspect years after the murders. Some modern DNA testing of a shawl claimed to have belonged to Catherine Eddowes suggested a link to Kosminski's family line, though the reliability of this evidence is heavily disputed. Another figure often mentioned is Michael Ostrog, a Russian-born conman and thief. He was named in police memoranda, but there is little evidence he had any connection to the murders. Likewise, Thomas Cutbush, a medical student confined to an asylum, was accused by newspapers, but largely dismissed by investigators. Perhaps the most sensational suspect was Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, grandson of Queen Victoria. Rumors spread that the prince was either the killer himself or involved in a conspiracy to cover up the crimes. These theories, fueled by scandalous gossip and anti-monarchy sentiment, captured the public imagination but lacked any factual basis. Historians today dismiss royal involvement as pure myth. Other suspects ranged from doctors and butchers to lunatics and foreign sailors. In total, more than 100 names have been proposed over the decades, each reflecting the fears and prejudices of the time. But in 1888, none could be proven guilty. Part of the difficulty lay in the lack of reliable witness testimony. Several people reported seeing women with potential suspects shortly before their deaths, but descriptions varied wildly. Some claimed the killer was a foreign-looking man with a dark mustache. Others described a shabby laborer, while still others swore he was a well-dressed gentleman, with gas lamps casting weak light and the streets often cloaked in fog. Eyewitness accounts were inevitably uncertain. Police even experimented with primitive methods of criminal profiling. Dr. Thomas Bond, a police surgeon, examined the victims and offered one of the earliest known criminal profiles. He suggested the killer was a man of solitary habits, subject to periodic attacks of homicidal mania, and with some knowledge of anatomy. But his insights, though pioneering, did little to narrow the search. The frustration of the investigation was compounded by the constant interference of the press. Reporters swarmed crime scenes, questioning witnesses before detectives could, and printing sensational claims that often muddied the facts. Public anger boiled over at Scotland Yard. Critics accused the police of incompetence, corruption, or indifference to the plight of poor women in the East End. To restore order, authorities even considered extreme measures. Some suggested offering rewards, while others proposed flooding Whitechapel with undercover officers. At one point, police dogs were tested for use in tracking the killer, but the experiment failed. Commissioner Sir Charles Warren, already unpopular, eventually resigned under the weight of criticism. His departure was seen as an admission of defeat in the Ripper case. Despite the failures, investigators left behind thousands of pages of reports, statements, and memoranda. These documents remain the backbone of Ripper studies today. They show how diligently the police worked, yet also how hopelessly outmatched they were by the limits of 19th century science. The failure to catch Jack the Ripper also revealed deeper issues within Victorian society. The lives of poor women, especially prostitutes, were seen as expendable by many in power. The press described the victims in lurid terms, often blaming them for their own deaths. Only when the brutality of the murders became undeniable did the city's elite begin to pay attention to the conditions in Whitechapel. Even then, the focus was often on the scandal, not on social reform. As the winter of 1888 passed, the murders suddenly stopped. Mary Jane Kelly, killed in November, is widely believed to have been the Ripper's final victim. After that, the trail went cold. For months, detectives remained on edge, waiting for another body to appear. But it never came. Jack the Ripper had vanished as suddenly as he arrived. Why did the killings stop? Some believe the murderer was arrested for an unrelated crime, imprisoned before he could strike again. Others argue he may have died, committed suicide, or left London altogether. A darker possibility is that he simply chose to stop, having satisfied whatever twisted impulse drove him. For the investigators, the ending was bitter. They had dedicated months of sleepless nights, endured ridicule from the press, and faced the fury of the public, only to be left with no answers. Jack the Ripper became not only a criminal, but a symbol of the limits of Victorian justice. Over the years, countless theories have emerged. Some claim the Ripper was a surgeon practicing his skills, Others see him as a deranged loner, or a man driven by hatred of women, or even a figure protected by powerful interests. Each theory reveals more about the fears and imaginations of those studying the case than about the killer himself. In the end, Jack the Ripper remained what he always was, a shadow, a phantom who struck in silence, disappeared into the darkness, and left behind only questions. For the detectives of Scotland Yard, the failure to catch him was a wound that never healed. For the world, it was the birth of an enduring mystery. The hunt for the Ripper may have ended in frustration, but the legend had only just begun. The unanswered questions and unsolved nature of the crimes would ensure that Jack the Ripper's name lived on long after 1888, and as decades turned into centuries, his story would transform from a police investigation into one of the greatest enigmas in human history. When the winter of 1888 passed, and no more mutilated bodies appeared in the streets of Whitechapel, London breathed a fragile sigh of relief. But for Scotland Yard, the press, and the public, the wounds left behind by Jack the Ripper did not heal. The killer's sudden disappearance was not closure. It was the beginning of a legend. More than 130 years later, his name remains one of the most infamous in history. The question is not only who Jack the Ripper was, but why his story continues to grip the world. The first and most immediate legacy of the Ripper case was its impact on policing and criminal investigation. The failure to catch him exposed the weaknesses of Victorian law enforcement. The Metropolitan Police had no centralized database of suspects, no forensic science, and few specialized investigative techniques. The case revealed the desperate need for reform. In the years that followed, policing began to evolve. Fingerprinting was introduced in the 1890s. Crime scene preservation became more disciplined. Criminal profiling, first hinted at during the Ripper case, grew into a recognized practice. In many ways, the Ripper murders marked the painful birth of modern detective work. But the case was not only a milestone in policing. It was also a turning point in the relationship between crime and the media. The Ripper murders coincided with the rise of mass circulation newspapers. For the first time, a crime story was followed day by millions of readers, not just in Britain, but around the world. The newspapers fed on fear, and the public devoured every detail. The lurid illustrations, sensational headlines, and endless speculation transformed Jack the Ripper into the first true media-made serial killer. The press created a template that would be followed for generations. The naming of the killer, the printing of his letters, the constant updates, and the demonization of suspects all became standard features of crime reporting. The Ripper case showed that crime could be a form of spectacle, both terrifying and captivating. This duality, the horror and the fascination, continues to shape how we consume stories of killers even today, whether through headlines, documentaries, or films. Culturally, Jack the Ripper left an even deeper imprint. His story has been retold in countless books, plays, and films. Writers like Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes, were influenced by the atmosphere of mystery and dread that surrounded the case. Novels and stories about shadowy killers stalking foggy streets became a staple of Victorian Gothic literature. In the 20th century, the Ripper appeared in everything from serious historical studies to sensational pulp fiction. Hollywood embraced him, turning the gaslit alleys of Whitechapel into a cinematic stage. The Ripper also became a mirror for society's fears. At the time, his victims were often dismissed as fallen women, prostitutes whose deaths were seen as inevitable in the brutal streets of the East End. But in the decades that followed, attitudes shifted. Today, Marianne Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly are remembered as human beings whose lives mattered, not just as names on a list. Their suffering has inspired conversations about the vulnerability of women, the neglect of the poor, and the dangers of indifference. Another reason the Ripper's legacy endures is the enduring mystery of his identity. Thousands of theories have been proposed. Was he a surgeon? A butcher? A member of the aristocracy? An immigrant hiding in plain sight? Each new theory attracts attention. Each new book claims to solve the case, and yet the answer always slips away. The uncertainty itself is part of the fascination. Unlike other killers whose identities are known, Jack the Ripper remains a puzzle that invites endless speculation. The mystery is not just historical. It is psychological, tapping into the human desire to solve the unsolvable. In modern criminology, the Ripper is studied as a case of early serial murder. His killings fit a pattern that would later be recognized in other notorious criminals: ritualistic violence, escalation, taunting of authorities, and sudden disappearance. He is often cited in discussions of how social conditions, such as poverty and marginalization, create opportunities for predators. The Whitechapel murders also highlight how victims of crime are often ignored until violence forces society to take notice. Tourism, too, has become part of the Ripper legacy. Today, visitors to London can walk the same streets where the murders occurred, guided by tours that recount the horrors of 1888. Museums and exhibitions display artifacts from the case. While some see this as a macabre form of entertainment, others argue that it keeps the memory of the victims alive. Either way, the Ripper has become inseparable from London's identity, a grim attraction woven into its history. But the most lasting legacy may lie in the way the Ripper symbolizes the darkness within humanity. He was not a mythical monster, not a supernatural creature. He was a man, and yet he represented everything people feared: the unknown, the uncontrollable, the predator who strikes without warning. His presence in the foggy alleys of Whitechapel reminds us that evil can emerge from the ordinary, that horror can live next door, unseen. Jack the Ripper's legend endures because it sits at the crossroads of history, crime, media, and myth. His killings were real, his victims were real, but the figure of Jack has become something larger than fact. He is a story told and retold, reshaped by each generation to reflect its own fears and fascinations. In Victorian times, he symbolized the failure of the authorities and the dangers of urban poverty. In the 20th century, he became a Gothic villain, a symbol of the night. Today, He is studied as a case of social injustice, media sensationalism, and the psychology of violence. And yet, despite the endless books, theories, and investigations, one truth remains: we do not know who he was. The Ripper vanished into history as a shadow, leaving only speculation behind. This uncertainty is both frustrating and irresistible. For as long as the mystery remains unsolved, people will continue to search for answers. The 5 women of Whitechapel: Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, never lived to see justice. Their lives were taken by a man whose name we may never know. But in remembering them, we also remember the failure that allowed their killer to escape. Their deaths forced society to confront its prejudices, its neglect of the poor, and its desperate need for reform. In that sense, their tragedy reshaped history. As the fog rolls once more through the streets of London, the story of Jack the Ripper still lingers. He is the faceless figure in the alley, the whisper in the dark, the headline that refuses to fade. His crimes remind us of the fragility of safety, the power of mystery, and the enduring pull of unanswered questions. And so, more than a century later, Jack the Ripper remains what he always was: a shadow in the gaslight, a phantom in the fog, and a reminder that sometimes the greatest mysteries are the ones that refuse to be solved.